New York, the capital of the world, the city where the fate of millions is decided. But now, imagine if it looked completely different. Different streets, different architecture, and everyone around speaking Dutch. Sounds strange? Well, once upon a time, that was reality. Back in the 17th century, a small but ambitious nation controlled this city. The Dutch called it New Amsterdam and developed it as a key trading hub. But then they gave it away, and not for gold, not for land, but for a tiny island somewhere in the Indian Ocean. Why did they do it? What was so special about that island that outweighed the future capital of the world? Was it foolishness, a clever calculation, or a disastrous mistake? By the end of this video, we'll find out who truly won this bizarre trade. In the 17th century, the Netherlands was something of a global trade powerhouse. Their ships sailed across the world, bringing back spices, textiles, furs, and other valuable goods. The Dutch established colonies in Asia, Africa, South America, and of course, North America, where they founded New Netherland. The crown jewel of these territories was New Amsterdam, a bustling port city on the island of Manhattan. It was a vital trade hub, alive with activity. Ships arrived loaded with goods, markets thrived, and locals spoke a mix of Dutch, English, French, and even indigenous languages. It seemed like the Dutch had everything under control. But nearby, the English, seasoned colonizers who didn't tolerate competition, were watching. They had their eyes on New Amsterdam, and when the question arose about who should control this strategic city, negotiations began. Now, imagine how that must have played out. Somewhere around 1664, the office of the Dutch governor of New Amsterdam. So, gentlemen, the English want our city, but I have a plan. We won't fight them. We'll outsmart them. How? Asks an advisor, bewildered. Simple. We'll trade this, small but promising waterfront town for something truly valuable. For what? An island. But not just any island. A place where nutmeg grows. Nutmeg. Not just any nut, a rare spice without which our kitchens are a sad excuse for culinary art. Imagine, a monopoly on nutmeg. We'll control the flavors of all of Europe. The advisor stares at the governor, then at the map, completely baffled. So, we're giving up a strategic port for food, not just food, a spice. Do the English know we're outsmarting them? They think they're winning, but in reality, pauses. Okay, maybe they are winning. But was nutmeg really worth more than a future global metropolis? Let's find out. England and the Netherlands had been rivals for control of sea routes and colonies for years. Their trade interests clashed from Indonesia to the Caribbean, but New Amsterdam was particularly important. It sat in a strategic location, controlled the Hudson River, and dominated the fur trade and other commerce in North America. In 1664, England's King Charles II decided it was time to take the city. He sent a fleet to the shores of Manhattan. It looked like war was about to break out, but it never even started. The Dutch governor, Peter Stuyvesant, wanted to fight back, but local merchants and settlers saw no point in resisting. Instead, they simply handed the city over to the English without a battle. And just like that, New Amsterdam became New York. The Dutch could have tried to reclaim it, but instead, they chose a different approach. They decided to trade it for another piece of land. But why that island in particular? Instead of going to war, the Netherlands took a different approach. They decided to negotiate. In 1667, the Treaty of Breda was signed, officially granting New Amsterdam to the English. But in return, the Dutch received a small island called Run in Indonesia. At first glance, the deal seemed like a win. New Amsterdam had potential, but at the time, it didn't seem like a crucial asset. Run Island, on the other hand, was a gold mine. It was the only place in the world where nutmeg grew, one of the most valuable spices of the era. The Dutch dreamed of monopolizing the spice trade and bet everything on it. But was it the right choice? After all, today New York is the capital of the world, while Run Island. But what if things had turned out differently? Imagine this. New York, the city of skyscrapers, the financial capital of the world. But once upon a time, it was traded away for a tiny island. Why? In the 17th century, nutmeg was worth more than gold. People believed it could cure all diseases, protect against the plague, and elevate elite cuisine. And the only place in the world where it grew? A small island called Run in Indonesia. The Dutch wanted to monopolize the spice trade, so they struck a deal, trading New Amsterdam for this so-called spice paradise. But was it really worth it? Today, New York is a global powerhouse, while Rhode Island, well, have you ever even heard of it? But how could a spice be worth more than an entire city? Let's find out. Today, we think of spices as ordinary, but in the 17th century, nutmeg was literally a treasure. It was more expensive than gold, and people believed it could cure the plague, extend life, and even ward off evil spirits. The fight for control over this market was fierce. The Dutch wanted to monopolize nutmeg production and eliminate their competition. Rhode Island was the key to this strategy. It was one of the only places where the rare trees producing this valuable spice grew. At the time, the trade seemed like a brilliant move. New Amsterdam was just a small settlement, while nutmeg was bringing in huge profits. But time proved the Dutch had miscalculated. New York rapidly grew into a global powerhouse, while Rhode Island. What happened to it, and why did New York become the center of the world? After New Amsterdam became New York, the city began to grow rapidly. The English invested in its development, attracted new settlers, and turned it into a key trade hub. Within a century, New York became the gateway to the New World, and eventually, one of the largest megacities on the planet. And what about Rhode Island? The Dutch guarded it fiercely, ruthlessly crushing any attempts at competition. They even burned down nutmeg trees on neighboring islands to maintain their monopoly. For a while, their plan worked, and the spice remained incredibly expensive. But the most frustrating part of this story wasn't even losing New York. The Dutch believed they had secured an invaluable asset, but soon, their calculation turned out to be a massive and costly mistake. How did it all go wrong? The Dutch were thrilled with their nutmeg monopoly, but their triumph was short-lived. Before long, the English found a way to bypass their control. They seized other islands where nutmeg also grew and started selling it at lower prices. The Dutch monopoly collapsed. What once seemed like the deal of the century turned into a strategic disaster. New York kept growing and prospering, while Rhode Island lost its value. Today, only historians remember its significance, whereas New York stands as one of the most important cities in the world. In the end, the Netherlands traded away the future financial capital of the world for a worthless patch of land. And you know what that sounds like? Imagine being given a choice: a small but promising apartment in the heart of a booming city, or a bag of spices. The Dutch, it seems, chose the latter. This trade is eerily similar to the famous Bitcoin story. In 2010, someone bought 2 pizzas for 10,000 Bitcoins. At the time, it seemed like a fair deal, just like trading New York for Rhode Island. But as history shows, that decision aged poorly. Just think about it. Today, those 10,000 Bitcoins are worth hundreds of millions of dollars, while those pizzas, long gone. The same way, New York grew into a global financial powerhouse, while Rhode Island faded into historical obscurity. But what if the Dutch had made a different choice? Imagine this. Instead of the Statue of Liberty in the heart of Manhattan, there's a windmill. Sounds strange? Well, it could have been reality. If the Dutch had never traded away New Amsterdam, America might have looked very different. Maybe people in the US would be speaking Dutch, and instead of Broadway, there'd be Breideweg, as the street was originally called. Instead of hot dogs, street vendors might be selling herring, and New York would still be called New Amsterdam. Of course, history took a different turn, but this trade forever changed the world. But just how much did it shape the future? Let's find out. The trade of New Amsterdam for Rhode Island turned out to be one of the worst deals in history. The English gained a key city that would eventually become a global hub of economy and culture. Meanwhile, the Dutch lost their strategic foothold in North America, and their nutmeg monopoly soon crumbled. The Dutch saw the deal as an immediate win, without considering the long-term consequences. At the time, spices were incredibly valuable, but history proved that trade routes shift while cities grow and evolve. This story is a reminder of how important it is to think ahead, rather than focus only on short-term gains. After all, Who knows how history might have unfolded if they had made a different choice. Now, imagine what this kind of trade might look like in today's world. In Amsterdam, 1667, a group of Dutch merchants sits in a dimly lit room, dressed in lavish wigs. A large world map hangs on the wall. One of them adjusts his glasses and speaks. "Gentlemen, we have an important decision to make. We're trading away a boring patch of land with wooden houses for an island full of nutmeg." Another merchant sipping his beer. "Are we sure there's nothing valuable there? I mean, what if this new Amsterdam turns into something big in a couple of centuries?" The lead merchant laughs. "Oh, come on. It's just dirt roads, a few shops, and what's it called? Broadway? Worthless land." A voice crackles from across the room. "Sorry, I lost connection for a second. Are we completely sure about this trade?" The merchants exchange glances, shrug, and press the Approve Trade button. And just like that, with one click, the Netherlands lost New York. But what does this mean for us today? Today, New York is one of the most influential cities on the planet, a financial powerhouse, home to the world's biggest corporations, stock exchanges, and cultural landmarks. Millions dream of coming here, and Manhattan real estate is worth a fortune. And what about Rhode Island? It faded into obscurity, remembered only by historians. Nutmeg hasn't been valuable for centuries, and the island itself remains a tiny, insignificant patch of land in the Indian Ocean. A deal that once seemed like a smart move in the 17th century turned out to be a catastrophic loss for the Netherlands. At the time, no one could have predicted how much New York would grow. But now the question is different. Was the trade worth it? Monsieur Hussein. You're about to find out. So, was the trade worth it? The answer is obvious, no. New York became the financial and cultural capital of the world, while Rhode Island remained just a tiny speck on the map. The Dutch traded away a future megacity for a spice whose value soon collapsed. This is a classic example of how short-term gain can cloud strategic thinking. In 1667, nutmeg seemed priceless, but time proved that real wealth isn't in spices, it's in cities, people, and opportunities. Maybe next time, the Dutch should think twice before swapping an entire metropolis for a seasoning.